On the 19th of December in the year 1944, the atmosphere inside the headquarters of General Dwight D. Eisenhower in Verdun was heavy with tension. The pervasive scent of damp wool mingled with the lingering smell of cigarette smoke, creating an atmosphere that reflected the strain of ongoing conflict. Outside the window, German tanks advanced relentlessly through the Ardennes forest, carving a wide, menacing bulge into the Allied front lines, a development that would soon earn a notorious nickname. Inside the room, a group of staff officers hunched over strategic maps, their faces drained of color by exhaustion and something thicker and more alarming, fear. It was a moment that hinted at chaos, a crisis unfolding with terrifying speed. The entrance of Lieutenant General George Patton disrupted the tense silence. Some officers, already battered by the bleakness of the situation, remained silent, not even raising their eyes. They had absorbed the reports, smashed units, communication lines severed, overwhelming enemy forces, everything suggesting that the situation was dire and beyond immediate control. The surprise attack had caught them off guard in a manner unbelievable, with approximately 250,000 German soldiers and about 1,000 tanks crossing into Allied territory, throwing the entire American First Army into disarray. Units had been shattered, command structures had disintegrated, and confusion reigned. Into this chaos, Patton strolled with characteristic vigor and confidence, a figure known for his fiery temperament and bold declarations. His reputation for aggressive tactics and a reckless, sometimes controversial, combat style hovered like an aura around him. As he entered, some officers, burdened by despair or skepticism, chose to ignore him, their minds preoccupied with the grim reality. They'd already heard the reports, no need for further discussion. The enormity of the situation was clear enough. The Allies faced a potentially devastating blow, and time was against them. Despite the bleakness, Patton was about to make a statement that sounded almost impossible. When Eisenhower turned to him and posed a question that captured the very core of their dilemma, how quickly could the Third Army be repositioned to counter this surprise? The general didn't hesitate. Without a trace of doubt, he responded that he could have his entire force reoriented and in attack position within 48 hours. He confidently claimed he could move 3 divisions through the freezing winter landscape, rallying them to strike back in just 2 days. The room fell into stunned silence, the enormity of such an assertion settling heavily over everyone. Then, as if in response to the impossible feat, someone in the room let out a bitter, sarcastic laugh, which was quickly suppressed, an expression of disbelief or perhaps skepticism. The idea was preposterous. Pulling 6 combat divisions out of active fighting, turning them 90 degrees, and marching those 100 miles through what was arguably the harshest winter in decades, all while keeping the troops combat ready, all within a mere 48 hours. To many, it was an outright violation of the fundamental principles of military logistics and practical planning. A staff officer muttered what others might have been thinking aloud, that Patton had finally lost his grip on reality. Yet, behind the bravado and the apparent madness, Patton was neither lying nor driven by madness. Unbeknownst to those present, including the German commanders who celebrated their surprise as an unassailable success, Patton had already prepared meticulously for this very scenario. Days prior, he had devised multiple contingency plans. Routes had been carefully mapped, units were pre-designated for specific tasks, and orders were drafted, waiting only for command issuance. While others scrambled in sudden confusion, trying to comprehend the unfolding crisis, Patton had already moved beyond simple reaction to the stage of deliberate execution. This story recounts how the man whom the Germans regarded as their most formidable adversary and whom many allies doubted for his brashness managed to turn an ostensibly impossible logistical challenge into a catastrophic defeat for the Reich on the Western Front. George Smith Patton Jr., at the time only 59 years old, found himself confronting not the scarcity of years, but the urgent pressure of time slipping away, his own time, his war. He had devoted his entire life to military service, born into a family with a deep-seated martial tradition. The stories of his ancestors, who had fought across every American conflict since the Revolution, had been woven into his upbringing. His grandfather had fallen at the Third Battle of Winchester during the Civil War, a sacrifice that weighed heavily upon Patton. This legacy pressed down upon him like a tangible burden, a mantle of duty and expectation he carried through every campaign. By December of 1944, Patton was commanding the Third Army, a formidable force comprising over 250,000 men, hundreds of tanks, and the most aggressive armored units the Allies had fielded in Europe. Yet, despite all his achievements, his campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and the rapid invasion across France, there existed whispers of doubt. Some critics and skeptics noted that Patton excelled when the enemy was in retreat, when pursuit was straightforward, but questioned how he would fare against a determined, resisting enemy. The autumn of 1944 had been particularly brutal. The German counteroffensive in the Ardennes was an unanticipated blow that tested the resilience of the Allied armies to their limits, pushing even the most seasoned commanders to their edges. Against this backdrop, Patton's relentless fighting spirit and daring tactics became more critical and more scrutinized than ever before. Yet, amidst the chaos and the harsh winter conditions, Patton's resolve remained unshaken. His advance across the region of Lorraine, moving steadily toward the heavily fortified city of Metz, had increasingly slowed down until it became a sluggish and difficult march. The campaign was marked by relentless, fierce battles, which resulted in significant casualties on both sides. Supply lines became stretched and overburdened, leading to critical shortages for his forces. This phase of warfare, characterized by a grueling war of attrition where every gain was fiercely contested and costly, made him resemble many other generals caught in the same exhausting struggle, focused on grinding down the enemy through sustained pressure rather than swift victories. Soon after, a different chapter of his military career unfolded in August of the year 1943 during the campaigns in Sicily. This period was marred by controversy, stemming from two separate incidents where he, driven by a combination of frustration, fatigue, and perhaps overconfidence, physically struck soldiers suffering from what at the time was called battle fatigue. These actions nearly resulted in the end of his career as a military officer. High command, notably General Dwight D. Eisenhower, seriously debated whether to send him back home in disgrace, effectively ending his service altogether. The news of these incidents quickly reached the press, sparking public outrage and calls for stern disciplinary action, including courts-martial. However, Eisenhower, who was aware of deeper complexities behind the scenes, understood something that the newspapers and the public did not. He realized that the German soldiers and commanders harbored a deep fear of Patton, whose reputation as a fierce and relentless leader was well known among enemy ranks. Intercepted German communications indicated that field commanders would specifically inquire about Patton's whereabouts before making strategic decisions, underscoring the terror he instilled. Despite his questionable behavior in Sicily, Eisenhower chose to retain Patton's services but strategically sidelined him to prevent further controversy. Instead of allowing him to command directly on the front lines, Eisenhower assigned him to a deception operation designed to mislead the Germans about Allied intentions. Patton was tasked with leading a fictitious First Army group, which was supposedly preparing to invade the continent at Calais. For months, Patton acted as a decoy, while other Allied troops prepared for the actual invasion in Normandy. For a man who had always believed himself destined for greatness as a marshal of the army, this role as a mere decoy felt like a kind of personal death, an almost humiliating surrender of his perceived prime purpose to serve as a pawn in a larger deception. Yet, despite the setback, Patton remained committed to the mission. By mid-December, Colonel Oscar Coe, Patton's G2 intelligence officer, started noticing peculiar patterns emerging in German radio traffic. Certain units had mysteriously gone silent, disappearing from the order of battle, and radio silence of that magnitude was often a prelude to major operations. Coe brought his concerns directly to Patton on December the 9th, which was an entire week before the Germans launched their offensive. During their discussion, Coe explained, "General, I believe they're massing for a large-scale attack, most likely in the Ardennes sector, which is lightly defended and favorable terrain for a surprise assault." Patton, however, interrupted him, cutting off the warning, and simply responded, "I know. I've been considering the same possibilities myself." Together, they studied maps and considered the strategic potential of the Ardennes region. From a German perspective, This area made sense as a point of attack. It was where they had broken through the French defenses in 1940, routing the largely unprepared French army. The terrain was notoriously difficult: dense forests, narrow mountain roads, and rugged hills, which made it a challenging region for armored units, especially during winter. The Allies believed that such conditions would hinder any large-scale armored offensive in that season, leading to a dangerous but mistaken assumption that the Germans would opt for a different approach. The Germans, aware of this underestimation, counted on the Allies' belief that winter weather and terrain would thwart any substantial armored attack in that area. Patton's response to the looming threat was what later came to be recognized either as extraordinary foresight or as obsessive overplanning. He ordered his staff to prepare detailed contingency plans for a quick and decisive northern maneuver, an about-face of approximately 90 degrees, to thrust his forces into the flank of the German assault. 3 distinct plans were devised, each involving different units and varying in scale, yet none of these plans had Eisenhower's approval. Patton did not inform his superiors nor seek their consent. Instead, he relied on his staff to quietly develop these strategies behind the scenes. When the German offensive finally erupted on December the 16th, Patton was at his headquarters in Nancy. The moment the battle started, the phone rang, and it was the Chief of Staff to General Omar Bradley. The message was succinct but urgent. "George, we've got a serious situation. The Germans have attacked in the Ardennes. It's a substantial and dangerous breakthrough." Patton's initial reaction was not panic. It was surprisingly composed and close to a sense of pragmatic satisfaction, believing that this was the perfect opportunity to engage and contain the Germans in the region. "Good," he said. "We can strike them there just as effectively as anywhere else." The critical meeting scheduled in Verdun on December the 19th has been described in numerous historical accounts because of its importance. However, many of those narratives overlook the intense psychological tension that pervaded that room. Eisenhower, under immense pressure from multiple sides, faced mounting doubts about the overall success of the Allied effort. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was raising pointed questions about the capability and readiness of the American forces. Meanwhile, the media began to sense and report on the unfolding disaster, and German radio broadcasts loudly claimed a massive defeat for the Allies, further adding to the sense of crisis. In that tense atmosphere, the decision-making process was fraught with stress, each leader grappling with the realization that the outcome of this critical phase could potentially alter the course of the entire campaign. The assembly of military leaders around the strategic table embodied a diverse array of doctrines and philosophies about how best to wage war. Among them was British Field Marshal Montgomery, renowned for his cautious, systematic approach, with a particular focus on meticulously planned, large-scale set-piece battles. His strategy reflected a belief in careful preparation and deliberate maneuvers, emphasizing conventional methods of engagement. In contrast, General Bradley exuded a steady reliability, being recognized for a calm, dependable temperament. However, he couldn't hide the visible signs of concern, still visibly shaken by the disastrous collapse of his First Army during previous operations. Then there was General Patton, a figure whose reputation was often mixed in the room. Some regarded him as a formidable, aggressive leader, while others continued to see him as a potential source of instability or unpredictability in their plans. Eisenhower, who presided over the meeting, chose his words with care, aiming to project optimism despite the gravity of the situation. He stated that the current military circumstance was, in fact, an occasion of opportunity rather than impending catastrophe. His deliberate tone was meant to instill confidence in his assembled commanders, emphasizing that the situation could be turned to their advantage if managed correctly. According to various reports and testimonies from those present, Patton responded to this with a broad grin, practically brimming with his characteristic boldness. He famously quipped, "Hell, let's have the guts to let them go all the way to Paris. After that, we'll be able to cut them off completely and tear into their supply lines." His words reflected a daring, perhaps reckless optimism, suggesting a strikingly aggressive move that would push the front deep into enemy territory. This prompted Eisenhower to pose a critical question, highlighting the strategic complexity involved. "What Patton has proposed," he asked, would violate every principle the other generals understood about military movement. To understand why Eisenhower hesitated, it is necessary to fully grasp what executing such a maneuver actually entailed. Turning an entire army, particularly a substantial part of the forces, was no simple matter. The Third Army was not a singular, cohesive unit in itself. It comprised 6 full divisions, each consisting of roughly 15,000 soldiers. These divisions were supported by thousands of vehicles, including trucks, supply trains stretching over miles, and hundreds of tanks, all actively engaged in combat operations near the towns of Metz and in the Saar region. The units were in direct contact with enemy forces, engaged in fierce combat, making their movement all the more complicated. The roads they relied upon for repositioning weren't modern highways as we think of them today. Instead, they were narrow country lanes, many of which were unpaved, rutted, and difficult to navigate, especially in winter conditions. By mid-December, temperatures had dropped below freezing, turning the landscape into a frozen, treacherous expanse covered in snow and ice. The conditions made even the tiniest mechanical failure potentially disastrous. A single vehicle breaking down or getting stuck could block an entire column for hours, causing a chain reaction of delays. The logistical challenges were, quite simply, nightmarish in scope and complexity. Rearranging supplies was a monumental task. Ammunition depots had to be rerouted and fuel supplies repositioned, all while maintaining operational security, secrecy, and coordination. These operations had to be completed within an incredibly tight window, just 72 hours, without alerting the enemy or compromising the overall plan. When Patton stated that the move could be achieved in 48 hours, he was not merely guessing. He was speaking from a position of careful planning and confidence. His chief of staff, General Hobart Gay, had already divided the entire redeployment into well-defined phases long before Patton even left Verdun. On the night of December 19th, over 100 miles front, American units initiated what would go down in military history as the most complex and rapid redeployment possible. The 4th Armored Division, which was designated to spearhead the push toward Bastogne, had to disengage from combat near Saarbrücken, then rapidly reposition 90 miles to the north and arrive in fighting condition, all within less than 48 hours. Remarkably, they succeeded. Despite the formidable obstacles, their vehicles and troops managed to execute this swift movement with minimal losses, only a handful of vehicles failing due to mechanical issues. This level of logistical achievement defied every traditional military calculation. It seemed impossible, even foolish, considering the conditions and resources involved. Yet, what made this logistical miracle happen was an unseen but highly effective mentality, the Red Ball Express approach to supply and movement. The entire supply corps adopted a philosophy of continuous, non-stop movement, treating the repositioning not as a pause or setback, but as an extension of ongoing operational movement. Convoys were kept in motion at all times, minimizing idle time and preventing delays. Supply officers, granted quick and decentralized authority, created ad hoc fuel and ammunition dumps along the new route overnight, transforming static supply caches into mobile, responsive assets. This approach was rooted in mass production principles. Reserves of supplies and spare vehicles were available to replace those broken or rendered unusable in the harsh winter mud. Instead of suffering true bottlenecks, the American logistics system enabled rapid replacements. Every vehicle that failed got immediately swapped out from the enormous staged reserves in France. The effectiveness of this system was further bolstered by superior communications technology. Crucial orders to shift and redeploy troops and supplies were transmitted via encrypted radio channels, ensuring swift and secure command. Meanwhile, German forces, relying heavily on slow and unreliable motorcycle couriers, had already fallen behind, losing their advantageous position in the race to execute these movements, granting the Americans an uncontestable head start. Meanwhile, back at the German command center, a sense of victory and confidence was palpable among the officers and strategists. They were well aware that Patton's Third Army had advanced to the south, but under what they believed to be normal military circumstances, they dismissed the threat posed by such a large, mobile force. They held the reasonable but ultimately misguided assumption that Patton's troops would need at least 2 full weeks to organize and mount any significant counterattack, giving them a false sense of security and a false sense of control over the situation. This failure to anticipate the true pace and resolve of the American forces stemmed from a kind of self-imposed blindness, a refusal to recognize the industrial might that powered the American war effort and the rapidity with which it could mobilize resupply and reinforcement. The German leadership's focus was fixated on Hitler's Grand Master Plan, which placed great emphasis on seizing vital Allied fuel depots, especially those located at Spa and Stavelot. Their most advanced spearhead, known as the Camp Group Piper, was quickly compromised, suffering from the effects of their logistical shortcomings. This resulted in their formidable columns of Tiger II tanks becoming bogged down as they encountered slow-moving bottlenecks along secondary roads, hampering their effectiveness. Piper's forces were painfully aware that they lacked sufficient fuel reserves to reach their intended objectives, forcing them to capture American supplies en route. Yet, they underestimated the resilience and logistical strength of Patton's Third Army, which was moving forward with fully fueled tanks and ample ammunition, in stark reminder of the industrial reality that the Germans had failed to see. The American logistical system did not depend on luck or chance. Instead, it relied on an almost inexhaustible capacity for resupply that kept their forces supplied despite the harshest conditions. Unbeknownst to the Germans, the most formidable threat, the man commanding that enormous, relentless force, was already in motion, executing his plan with precision and resolve. The date was December 22, 1944. That morning, at 6 o'clock, the attack of the Third Army ignited, even as the weather conditions threatened to halt all military activity. The bitter cold flashed through the air, with temperatures dropping to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, which is minus 13 degrees Celsius. Over the previous night, a massive storm system had swept in, blanketing the landscape with 6 inches of new snow atop the already icy roads. This extreme weather was just as deadly as enemy fire, causing wounds that ordinary combat did not. Vehicles froze in place, and the oil within machine guns turned into thick, sluggish sludge. Tank engines refused to start unless their oil pans were heated with blowtorches, adding to the logistical nightmare. Despite these overwhelming hardships, the attack pressed forward, driven by the fierce determination of the soldiers of the Third Army. These soldiers faced an enemy few stories depict, fighting not only the Germans, but also the brutal, unyielding terrain. Every mile gained by the 4th Armored Division was hard-won, an arduous struggle against the frozen earth that challenged both their resolve and their equipment. To insulate themselves against the freezing cold, American infantrymen wrapped burlap sacks around their boots while tank crews jammed newspapers into their uniforms for extra warmth. The snow made every movement unpredictable, hampering the ability to plan and execute attacks with precision. The Germans, meanwhile, were suffering from material inferiority worsened by their own logistical shortcomings. Many of their vehicles ran on synthetic oils, which performed woefully in the bitter cold, and their armored giants, the Tigers and Panthers, became logistical nightmares. These tanks, designed to be formidable weapons, were vulnerable in freezing conditions, their systems frozen or malfunctioning, trapping them in the very forests they had hoped to dominate. The advance of the 4th Armored Division toward Bastonia covered only about 7 miles on the first day, an incredibly difficult 7 miles through heavily defended terrain, fighting both the German forces and the frozen, treacherous landscape simultaneously. Each village encountered became a separate battlefield, transforming tank warfare into brutal, close-quarters combat. Despite these hardships, Patton's overwhelming numbers worked to his advantage. For every Sherman tank destroyed, 2 more quickly took its place, ensuring a constant flow of firepower. His well-established supply lines continued to deliver ammunition and fuel, maintaining the momentum of the attack despite the bitter cold and logistical chaos. The town of Bastonia sat strategically at a vital crossroads, where 7 roads converged, making it a key objective. By December the 22nd, the American 101st Airborne Division had been encircled for 6 days, and the situation was increasingly desperate. They were running low on ammunition, with supplies dwindling rapidly, and time was running out for the beleaguered defenders. During the intense battles for the Ardennes sector, German commanders urgently sent an ultimatum demanding surrender, flying a white flag as a symbolic gesture of plea. In response, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, who was acting as the commanding officer of the 101st Airborne Division, received and read this message. Facing a desperate situation, he responded with a single, now famous word: nuts. This succinct yet resolute refusal quickly grew into a legendary rallying cry, embodying defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. However, the true significance of this symbolic act was only realized when it was reinforced by the arrival of General George Patton's relief forces. It was Patton's troops who turned the tide and made that daring stand truly meaningful. On the 20th of December, as the German offensive intensively pressed forward, Patton had an unusual request for his chaplain, Colonel James O'Neill. Summoning him, Patton asked sincerely, "Chaplain, I want you to prepare a prayer for good weather." O'Neill, recognizing the importance of this plea, composed a prayer that was then disseminated among every soldier in the Third Army. The prayer read as follows: "Almighty and most merciful Father, grant us fair weather for battle." This seemingly simple plea for favorable skies proved to be remarkably prophetic. By the 23rd of December, just 3 days later, the clouds above cleared, bathing the battlefield in sunlight. With the weather finally breaking, the ground attacks and air operations became possible again. Allied fighter bombers, which had been grounded for over a week due to stormy conditions, were now able to take to the skies once more. The psychological impact on the German forces was profound. The storm had previously provided them with cover and protection, but now that it had lifted, they found themselves exposed to the aggressive onslaught of Allied air power, which brought devastation and chaos. The breakthrough leading to Bastogne occurred on the 26th of December at approximately 4:15 p.m., a critical turning point in the battle. Lieutenant Charles Bogus, commanding a small platoon of Sherman tanks from the 41st Armored Division's 37th Tank Battalion, was maneuvering a snow-covered road when he called out to his men, "Come here." This is the 41st Armored. The corridor that Bogus' tanks had opened up was only about 500 yards wide, but this narrow path was enough to facilitate a vital breakthrough. Within hours, additional tanks and trucks flooded through this corridor, delivering supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements to the besieged garrison in Bastogne. By the end of December, the German offensive had reached its peak and was beginning to recede. The Germans faced severe shortages. Fuel supplies, in particular, were entirely exhausted, forcing their Luftwaffe aircraft to be shot down or grounded. When Bastogne was finally relieved, the offensive that had initially seemed unstoppable had already failed. Although the Germans remained unaware of this reality for some time, General Patton, sensing the shift in momentum and understanding intuitively that the battle was turning against them, said to General Bradley on the 28th of December, "Brad, this time the crowd stuck his head in a meat grinder, and I've got hold of the handle." This vivid expression captured the brutal and relentless nature of the push against the enemy forces. The systematic pursuit and elimination of German units followed, revealing the full extent of their retreat. The discarded equipment and vehicles told the final, irrefutable story of defeat. German forces abandoned nearly all their hardware, including dozens of massive Tiger tanks, mostly because they lacked fuel and could no longer sustain their offensive. The retreat from the Ardennes was a complete failure for the Germans. Their enterprise required flawless execution and an immediate collapse of Allied resistance, both of which did not materialize. Instead, the Allies' organized and well-prepared offensive transformed the dense Ardennes forest into a vast, unrecoverable graveyard for Germany's last operational armored reserves. By the 16th of January, when American forces from the north and south converged at Houffalex, the offensive was decisively eliminated. The Germans had suffered devastating losses, more than 100,000 soldiers killed or wounded, over 700 tanks destroyed or abandoned. The strategic toll was even more severe. The Ardennes offensive had drained Germany of its final operational reserves. When Soviet forces launched their winter offensive on the Eastern Front in January, the Germans had nothing left to oppose them effectively. The United States, however, had the capacity to replenish its losses and rebuild. Germany, in contrast, faced a much graver predicament. The swift deployment of 6 entire divisions within a mere 72 hours was not mere luck or chance. It was the result of meticulous planning, exceptional professionalism, and prescient strategic foresight. This rapid redeployment exemplified the high level of organizational excellence achieved by Allied forces, enabling them to respond decisively and effectively in critical moments of the battle. The fact that he meticulously devised contingency plans long before the German forces launched their attack exemplified a remarkable level of strategic foresight. This proactive approach reflected his understanding that in warfare, preparation and anticipation are often the differences between victory and disaster. After the conflict had concluded, when the German generals were subjected to intense interrogations by Allied intelligence officers, many of them were inevitably questioned about Patton's role and tactics. Among their testimonies, General Gunther Blumrich expressed a high regard for the American general, stating, "We considered General Patton to be the most modern and innovative commander in the field. We never anticipated such a swift reaction from him. We believed we would have at least 2 weeks before his Third Army could organize a response. Yet, he managed to disrupt our plans in just 2 days, which was nothing short of extraordinary." This rapid success left the Germans with a profound sense of dread and awe, as they had always regarded Patton with a mixture of respect and fear. Now, they understood the true reasons behind his reputation. In his personal diary, Patton himself documented one of the most critical moments of the campaign. On December 27th, he famously noted that the ability to reposition the Third Army and set it on the offensive in less than 3 days was a feat that might be regarded as a logistical masterpiece. But, as he pointed out, such a feat was really quite straightforward when one had a clear understanding of what needed to be done and had spent a lifetime preparing for it. Patton's entire career had been dedicated to mastering the art of maneuvering his forces with precision. In that instant, he was simply executing plans meticulously crafted from decades of study, training, and battlefield experience rather than improvising on the spot. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, also weighed in on this pivotal confrontation, referring to it as undoubtedly the most significant American battle of the entire war. He expressed his strong belief that this victory would be forever remembered as one of the most distinguished and renowned examples of American military triumph. The officers who had initially dismissed Patton's bold claim of accomplishing the operation within 48 hours were proven wrong, as Patton's actions surpassed all expectations, pushing beyond conventional limits. He understood, as all great strategists do, that in war, just as in life, the apparent impossibility is often merely the difficult, the challenge that few are willing to attempt. The Germans, too, initially mocked Patton's audacious timeline, dismissing his plans as overly optimistic. However, their laughter ceased abruptly once they found themselves retreating in disarray across snow-covered fields stained crimson with their own blood. Pursued relentlessly by an army that had seemingly appeared out of a winter storm, their defeat was swift and humiliating. The Ardennes offensive, which could have been perceived as Hitler's triumph, ultimately turned into his final and irreversible defeat. The chilling crimson splattered across the winter landscape was the blood of German soldiers, a stark contrast to the victorious force that had emerged. It was a brutal reminder that in the fog of war, the most unexpected victories often come from the most carefully prepared plans, and that perseverance combined with strategic brilliance can turn the tide even in the most dire circumstances.